So now our major event of the morning. It's a great pleasure to introduce celebrated authors Richard Powers and Kim Stanley Robinson. Now I could spend a fair amount of time, perhaps even the rest of the morning, reading some of the honors that our two distinguished writers have, but your program includes long descriptions of them. So I think I'm going to be brief and read maybe a top line for each of them. Richard Powers has written 13 novels which explore connections among disciplines as disparate as photographs, artificial intelligence, mentioned in the artwork, musical composition, a very central piece of his thought, ecology, genomics, game theory, virtual reality, race, biology, and business, a short line. And his first novel, which I was privileged to actually have come across in paperback form early on, it was called Three Farmers on the Way to a Dance. And of course, more recently, we have the Pulitzer Prize-winning Overstory. And on Kim Stanley Robinson, widely recognized as one of the leading living writers of science fiction, and of course now the near future in the great work on the Ministry for the Future. The Atlantic called his work the gold standard of realistic and highly literary science fiction writing. With that, let me turn it over to our two special novelists.
So here we are at the Fitzgerald Festival, and I was amazed and delighted to learn that Stan was in fact a great devotee of Fitzgerald growing up.
Well, it's true. I was an undergraduate at University of California, San Diego, about 50 years ago. And in high school, I had loved Shakespeare and murder mysteries, and that was it. And in Orange County, California, I felt like I was the only person aware of either one, but so it was kind of a bubble of, a very happy bubble of my own. As a reader, many of you will recognize this story. And then at university, my mom said, you should be a lawyer, you love to argue so much. And I was studying history and political science, but literature just took me away. And then I had to catch up and read everything. And Fitzgerald at that point was one of the big three. Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Faulkner. And it took a while to remember Zora Neale Hurston and other Willa Cather and other women writers of that era who were as good as the big three, but weren't in the classes in the same way. And at that point, I read all of Fitzgerald because I like to read in depth in the writers that I like. And he was good, and I hadn't read him since then. So it's about 50 years between readings. I just read his last three novels and an interesting collection of stories not published in his lifetime called I'd Die For You. It's worth checking out those stories for the kind of stuff he was writing that he couldn't get published because they had him in such a pigeonhole that he was only allowed to write one kind of story. And after he wrote 30 or 40 of those, he wanted to do other things, but they didn't let him. So those are good stories. One of them set right here in Rockville. So yes, it's been an amazing experience. And I take it you've been rereading them also.
I have. My experience with Fitzgerald as a young man was not as extensive as yours. I did go to high school, which means I did read Great Gatsby. and I dabbled beyond Gatsby when I was young. And there wasn't traction there for me initially. I'll talk a little bit about this more later, so I won't go into that now. But my delight in coming back to him again after half a century is discovering that my early sense of him was entirely wrong. And there was so much more there that I had somehow learned to see through the course of writing 13 books and spending 4 years thinking about these questions. And one question is, this theme of the mourning movement for this year's festival, which I suggested to the committee, and which is so brilliantly encapsulated in the statement that Gary statement and talk about that for an hour. This theme of interdependence and interconnectivity is also in Fitzgerald. And this realization that we have become deeply estranged from the northern region and need to refine it and reconnect is also in Fitzgerald. And you know, the most famous part of his work that all of you will remember is this great attempt at the very end of Gatsby to imagine what this story, this human disaster, in this already greatly diminished island that he's describing, what that place looked like before we got to it. And that, to me, seems like maybe the way that we can pivot from Fitzgerald to the manners of literary urgency that I think we want to talk about together.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. And you see in Fitzgerald an attention paid to the settings that his characters are in. So he's really a social novelist, and he's often about class. But the places that they're in, the alienation of these characters from, say, the beach on the French Riviera, where people are almost drowning, or it's just a background to their own social dramas. That Fitzgerald's very aware of that. And in Gatsby, going through the Valley of Ashes, the kind of destroyed industrial landscape between the rich person's house and the city, these are not accidental. He's paying attention to that relationship, even though he's mostly concerned with class. And when Fitzgerald said to Hemingway, you know, the rich are different from us, and Hemingway made a typical smartass reply, yes, they have more money. And, you know, as if that was the only difference. But Fitzgerald was saying, no, that having more money has changed them in ways that make them different from us because they were poor writers. Well, that was true, and he studied that, and he wrote about that. But to go to the more than human, I think we have to shift, well, to our work and to that, and to our the Earth Day, the growing awareness that the planet matters to humans.
But it's there in embryo at the end of Gatsby with this attempt to shift the point of view, you know, from this doomed quartet, you know, to off island, you know, and to looking back at the fresh green grass of the new world. And I thought I would tell a little story about my own personal journey back to that fresh green grass. And it started in Northern California, not far from where Sam has lived for a long time now. I was briefly on faculty at Stanford and living in Silicon Valley, which is itself the kind of Gatsby Central of our generation, where the rich have accumulated more money than even Hemingway or Fitzgerald could have imagined, and who consequently have created a culture that is deeply alienated from place. In fact, that has created a kind of fantasy of place interdependence. But the interesting thing about Silicon Valley is just above it, between the ocean and the valley, are the Santa Cruz Mountains. And, you know, I would go to dinner parties in Silicon Valley, and there would be these conversations among people saying, just stay healthy for a little while longer, because we're going to defeat death. There's a design flaw in life, and our technologies are going to overcome it. That's a somewhat aggressive culture. And to get away from it, I would go up into the Santa Cruz Mountains. And up in the Santa Cruz Mountains are these extraordinary forests of recovering redwoods. When I first hiked in them, I didn't know that I had to add that word recovery, because a redwood, in 100 years, can look like it's already been on the planet forever. I mean, they are enormous, girthy, bulky, beautiful, tall trees that dwarf your sense of significance. But that's only a 100-year-old. And while I was hiking these trails in the Santa Cruz Mountains, there was one day when I came across an escapee, a tree that had somehow avoided the fate of the rest of the forest that ran the length of the Central Peninsula, a 1,200 to 1,500-year-old tree. And I suddenly realized that these trees that were, merely 10 feet across were babies. And this monstrosity had been there since Charlemagne. And to stand in front of that tree and to look at something, half the width of this room at the base, and, a millennium and a half old, right? And as tall as a football field is long, was to change my sense of what life was trying to do. And there was this weird moment where I thought, this entire mountain range was cut down. There would have been trees this size all up and down the coast. And they were cut down to build San Francisco, to rebuild San Francisco, to build the railroad. And the reason Silicon Valley is down there, and the reason Stanford is down there spinning out the digital age, is because these trees were up here. It was a very odd moment of connectivity, a sense of human history that we rarely tell about ourselves.
Yeah, we're coming out of a history of the planet and the biosphere as raw materials for humans to build civilization out of, and the disregard for the biological support system that the planet represents for us, the way that the biosphere is really our extended body, so that people were in effect cutting off their feet to build their house and then stumping around, is a recent realization that we still have not come to terms with, and we haven't invented the civilization or the economics that would direct our own activities as human beings to life support systems, which is to say our extended body, the planet itself, that your work as adults should be, you should be able to make a living from helping the planet rather than tearing it out. Now, California, there's a fine line between a lucky thing and a curse. In fact, the two are often the same thing. So California, the gold rush, Hollywood, Silicon Valley, these three stupendous civilizational events have all impacted California to make it a special place. My home, a devastated landscape, the trees cut down, but also the Central Valley. People say it was the Serengeti of North America. The Central Valley was tule marshes, and it flooded in the springs, and then it dried out. It's a Mediterranean climate. That was treated as a factory floor for making food, and nothing mattered but to drain the wetlands, flatten things. As flat as this floor here, the Central Valley of California is actually flatter than, if you shrunk the Central Valley to the size of this room, the floor would be flatter than this, and turn it into a factory for making food, and all the wild animals are gone. And that's where I live, in the middle of a ecological devastation. Now, there are plans to bring it back, rewilding. This is a growing movement that recognizes our relationship to the biosphere and our dependence on it as being expressions of it. And so this is now a new story to tell, and I can see. Let's talk about you're writing about all these various topics that are of interest to you, and it's been a sequence of great novels, and then the tree thing.
Yep.
And when we met, I said, "What are you writing now?" I said, "Well, I'm doing a a tree thing. I'm going to write about trees. And I was thinking about Tolkien and the ants, and I was thinking, you go, Rick. This is going to be fabulous. The trees are going to be walking around talking to us. And that's sort of true, but sort of not true, because it's so intensely a realist that you had to do the story of the trees through your usual methods of realist characters in a real American story.
Yep.
How'd that go?
You know, when I had this conversion moment, my road to Damascus moment, and I, started to think about the stories that we tell about ourselves and how we got here, where we're going. And I became obsessed with this other kind of history, human history told through all of the agents and entities that permitted human history, but like the underclasses of humanity have been kept out of the story and rendered invisible. I started thinking about my production as a writer. And as I read more and more about how deeply dependent on trees and plants and place we are, all truths that we've tried to eradicate through various kinds of technologies, but we've also tried to eradicate it through our arts. And I started to look at the ways that we've been telling stories in America, and I noticed that we reached a moment where we erased our dependence on the rest of the living world. Or it became very hard to find. And I would read novels and still take the same kind of pleasure that we all take out of reading novels. But I'd say, where are all the supporting characters that make this story possible? And they weren't there. And that's where I began to think, how do we go back and use this form, which is so human-centric, and tell this other story, which is there is no humanity without the more than human world. Just as there was no Silicon Valley without the railroads. And two things occurred to me. One was that actually the absence of the humans, or the absence of the more than humans from human stories, is a very new thing. That if you look at American literature in the 19th century, it would have been impossible to tell the story of who we are, where we're going, without bringing in place really deeply, and without bringing in all the affordances of the living world really deeply and profoundly. So old stories, and in fact, most of world literature in most of the locations of the globe would never have dreamed to tell human stories without bringing in more than human. But there was another group of writers who never abandoned this idea that we have to think about life beyond the human, and that was the science fiction writers. That while literary fiction became more and more co-opted by a kind of capitalist vision, which is we're here in order to take dominion over the world and to monetize it, to instrumentalize it, the science fiction writers never stopped asking the question, what if the world at large, the living world, the universe, had different ideas than the human race? And this is where my friendship with you was, during this time, was really a valuable touchstone for me to try to find vessels and forms that were also that looked like archaic literature or older literatures, indigenous literatures, but also looked to recover many of the things that science fiction never lost, which is there is a third kind of drama. If you remember these three touchstones, I got this in 8th grade, I'm sure it's still being taught in some form, right? That we have drama when there is internal conflict between values inside an individual. There is drama when my values and your values are different. And there is drama when what human beings want and what the world will allow is different. So the formula that I got back in the day was man against man, man against himself, and man against the elements. And notice the sexist language there too. But my point, what I wanted to look back to you about was those three kinds of drama exist in pre-capitalist literature, and they continue to exist in many outposts inside capitalist cultures, but primarily science fiction and speculative fiction.
Well, thank you for that, Rick. And I am a science fiction writer, and this has been, like California, a lucky thing, and also a kind of a curse, because so many people think, well, I don't read science fiction, and so they miss out on a lot of good stuff. And the luck of it is an intense intellectual community, and also a sense of being an outlaw artist, very valuable in America, to be outside of the academy and the official sources of approval for literature, and be, the creature from the Black Lagoon. It's a beautiful position because America values its outlaw artists. It's a badge of honor to be a crazy person staggering in from the outside and bringing the news. So it's all good. I've loved it. But it also has been a limitation in terms of reaching certain audiences. But what it's given me and my community in literary terms is, okay, the relationship within yourself, very important. Then the relationship to other people, very important. The relationship to the planet, well, in science fiction, you arrive on a planet that's, well, all desert, and you have to cope, or you arrive at the planet where it's winter all the time, and you have to cope.
Or there are so many plants that want to get you.
Oh, you might get eaten by, yes, you land on the jungle planet, and this, which you can call the planetary romance, was very popular in the 1950s when rockets were there and were giving people the notion, well, we could go visit these places, which it turns out to be wrong, but it was a good story device for sure. Well, that always existed. Essentially, the ecological element was part of the story in science fiction and there to be put to use. So I would say, when Rick published the Overstory, I read it, like everybody, I loved it, but I was thinking also, and I wrote to him about this, there's an understory to the Overstory. And the understory is you needed science fiction to tell the story you wanted to tell. And because you didn't, the young woman in the story who really is speaking for the trees, who has kind of become a tree medium, as in spiritualist terms, and dies off for unfortunate reasons. And at that point, the author of the Overstory is like Calvin beating up on Hobbes really badly. Characters are suffering beyond the needs. Someone is thrashing that cast of characters that remains at the end of the Overstory in a way that was an excess of spiritual, psychological, unconscious energy. Mm-hmm. And I said, Rick, science fiction. And then we get Bewilderment. And I read the planetary romance chapters from Bewilderment last night. What a pleasure. These are beautiful chapters.
You can imagine my little amateur late life dabbling in a form and then hearing our great master of it read it in his voice was such a treat for me.
No, but these are beautiful. Rick is a gifted novelist, and so there's no special tricks. We are all science fiction writers in our own life. You make a plan, you say, if I execute this plan, I will get to a good place. That's your utopian science fiction story for yourself. If you're in the middle of the night, you're awake, insomniac, you're missing certain biochemicals that are very useful, and you begin to worry, and there's things to worry about, that's your dystopia. Things could go wrong, and maybe they already are wrong. So we're all science fiction writers. So once you take an interest as a novelist to give it a try, Rick said, well, what about empathy machines, this hokey old thing from the 1950s, where you put on a skull cap and suddenly you are reading other people's minds, telepathy, psi powers, Philip K. Dick, all this stuff is a little bit old-fashioned. Rick said, could I still do that? And I said, if anybody can do it, you can do it, give it a shot. And therefore, in bewilderment, it's, as far as I'm concerned, it's the first time that you've done science fiction in the proper sense as something from the future has been described in the present. Now, always there are scientists in Rick's novels, and so fiction about science and scientists, that's a subgenre or a separate genre. You could call it lab lit, or you could just call it what Powers does.
The great thinker Bruno Latour, who just died last week, wanted to try to call it scientific fiction.
Yes, but this is Hugo Gernsback.
Right.
1928, Hugo Gernsback with the first science fiction magazine, Amazing Stories, or whatever it was. Scientific fiction, how clever. But no.
To try to build on what Stan's just saying. So what my growing historical suspicion, and also my suspicion about my journey personally, was that we had reached a point in our ability to seemingly control the world through technological mediation, that we thought that third kind of story was obsolete. That there was no more drama there except in a nostalgic way, because we won that war. And this culture of human exceptionalism, we stand apart from everything else. The things that give us our extraordinary abilities make us not only quantitative, but qualitatively different from everything else alive. The only really important actor anymore in the world, because of our incredible technological leverage and prosthetic extension. That culture that says all meaning is ultimately going to be made by and for individual people. That's also a good capitalist message. And that meaning is going to be mediated through stuff, right? That the most meaningful thing that you can do is get bigger, grow, accumulate. Right? All of these cultural messages had somehow seeped into the literature to make it seem as if the only story worth telling were those where individuals making meaning for themselves were colliding with other individuals making meaning for themselves. How do we bring that third kind back? Well, it disappeared from American literature. You can see kind of in the golden age when the technology was getting so strong that this kind of metaphysical battle that Melville was raging, or writing about, trying to find in more than human both an enemy and a source of great, powerful meaning, right? That disappears and gets replaced by this other idea of stories as basically keeping ourselves company here in this world. But now, see, here's what I think is happening in this moment is as we all come to realize that not only did we not win that war, but we're about to be brutalized by it. Now fiction is waking up again to the need to tell a different kind of story, an older story and a newer story, one in which we are not the only characters.
Yeah, I can only agree with that, and I just want to point out that the Powers novel is almost a singular genre that he's created of his own, and this is partly because in what has been called the program era, post-war American literature went into the university systems and English departments, and it changed with MFA programs. So people were being taught how to write for the first time. It used to be that writers would stagger out of their hometowns and try to get published. They get published or not, and they were really quite singular. You can tell a Faulkner sentence from a Fitzgerald sentence. But the MFA program said, well, effectively it came down to rules, and it's been anatomized very beautifully in a book called The Program Era. Show, don't tell. This came out of Hemingway. Find your voice. That maybe is vulgar. And then write what you know. Well, there are mutual contradictions in these three, such that you can't actually do all three at once. So already you've got a problem. But I would say that one of the things that science fiction always did was ignore those rules and even reverse them. And I often tell student writers, tell, don't show, because you are not a mime here. You are actually telling people a story. So tell, don't show. Don't say his brow furrowed. Say he was angry. That kind of thing. And then write what you know, but we don't know anything, any of us. So you actually have to write what you don't know. You have to write the other. And so you write what you don't know. And then find your voice. I mean, what I would say is be a chameleon and find the voice of your characters and try to get out of the way and not even be there. But one more thing, though. Show, don't tell kills exposition, where you have to just show people things in living scenes, dramatized scene after dramatized scene after dramatized scene. And the thing that makes the Powers novel different is that exposition has been seamlessly put into the novel, so you learn a lot about AI or DNA and how scientists work in the lab as a new story that other people aren't telling because they just didn't know enough or they weren't interested in it. They didn't think the story was there. This whole world is being invented out of laboratories, and yet literature was never in the laboratory, which is a peculiar miss. So there was always something special before the overstory going on in the way that you could incorporate science into literary fiction, as they call it now, which is the programming fiction. And that's how, for me, as a reader, your novel stuck out. And there's very few others that you can point to also doing the same kind of thing.
Mm. Well, I love what you just said. And I wish I had known all of those precepts 28 years ago. But I'm learning them now. The challenge remains, and it's immense. I mean, we know as readers that the great joy of fiction, as we recompose a story when we read, is that for a while it gives us the ability to be somebody who we're not.
So true.
To really see the world through the eyes of someone whose trajectory has been entirely different than ours, whose values are entirely different, whose hopes, fears, and dreams are different than ours. And it's profoundly moving to us to not be ourselves for a while. And that's also the great joy and delight of our profession. When we get to wake up every day and take the road not taken and try to see the world through someone else's eyes. But now you see, if we're to survive the future that we've brought upon ourselves, it's going only to be by hugely increasing our capacity to make that empathetic leap beyond our species and to see what life itself wants and needs and hopes and fears. Now, how do you put that into a novel where everybody's readerly literacy and expectation is that novels are stories about people told through the points of view of people? And that's going to be the great challenge for young writers, how to bring more of the human back into a form where most readers are still only going to be able to identify through human characters. You struggled a bit with this in Ministry. You were telling an enormous story about the fate of mankind, of humankind, and how we're going to be able to get out of it. But you still needed to create individual people who were going to carry that load, because that's how we read.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, I love novels. They are, in effect, my religion. These precepts back here in the colorful wall are literature teaches you those. And you get to live other lives. And so these poor Silicon Valley tech billionaires, if you don't read fiction, you think, well, I need lifetime extension. I need to live 500 years. But if you read fiction, you will have lived 10,000 lives by the time you're done by an act of the imagination. It's a huge gift. and it requires an active participation as a reader. You have to be generous, you have to be creative, you have to be imaginative to turn these words on the page into an event in your head. Some people can do it, and some can't. But if you have it, it's a blessing for you. And then, okay, say you want a novel that does the non-human, that does history, that does even the future. You've got a form problem, but it's only a form problem. And the novel is extremely capacious. You can try all kinds of things in novels. And for Ministry for the Future, one thing that I found was the eyewitness account, where indeed you're telling, not showing. I was in Paris in May '68, and suddenly I was throwing paving stones at a police force, and I was just a kid, but now, 25 years later, it made me what I am today. Well, these stories are amazing, and they're told in 2 pages. So the novel is peculiar. You need 500 pages to tell that story? Well, maybe not. Maybe you only need the 2 pages. So you begin to be propulsive. You begin to summarize, and summarization is something that Rick can also do. The powers that develop when you go beyond show, don't tell are rather immense and make the novel in many ways more powerful than the movies. Because although the movies can show you things, they can't tell you things. They can't say, he worked for 10 years and never got anywhere and he felt like a dog in the kennel. How do you movieize that? You can't, but you can write those kinds of sentences. And Rick writes those kinds of sentences all the time. I myself in ministry just said, let's try every possible form that literature has ever given us, including the Anglo-Saxon riddle and memos from office meetings and stuff you don't want to actually have dramatized because it's too boring. So you give the notes from that meeting and that becomes that chapter. It's a way of playing games, and it's a way of making the novel fun again. So in a way it was an opportunity. Form problems are opportunities.
And speaking of fun, we wanted to set aside about a third of the session for questions. Yeah. And we've reached that point, so
yeah.
let's